to the Momversation Club, the podcast born out of the idea that every mum needs a tribe. I'm Claire Strong.
And I'm Christina Struckmeyer. We're two moms just like you, navigating the chaotic, challenging, and often isolating world of motherhood.
Now, it's said that it takes a village to raise a child, but we want to know, where the F is that village?
It's a question that resonates with so many of us who are finding ourselves raising children, managing careers, and trying to maintain our own identities, often with a sense of isolation.
Yes, but we're here to remind you that you're not alone. The Momversation Club is your village, a place where you feel valued, appreciated, and understood.
We believe that by sharing our own experiences, successes, and struggles, that we can create a virtual village for all you amazing moms out there.
So join us every week for a real, raw, and relatable discussion about all aspects of being a mum, including the things you just can't talk about with anyone else.
So if you've ever asked yourself, where the F is the village? Then you found your tribe. So let's get into it.
Hi, Christina.
Hey, Claire. How are you today?
I am good. How are you doing?
You know, I'm hanging in there. It's funny about today's topic because I am feeling the home stretch of waiting for said situation to happen. And I'm in that weird spot where like nobody say anything wrong to me.
Oh my God, really? Well, I better have my P's and Q's then for this episode.
I know. I was like, nobody has stepped on any landmines so far today, so that's great.
Well, that's good timing, actually, because we are going to be talking about that today. So,
yes,
our topic for today's episode is periods and how to approach all of that with our kids, especially daughters. Although, spoiler alert, we are going to touch upon how, if you have a son, it's also important for you to mention that as well. So we've got lots of good stuff coming up in today's episode.
Yeah, this was actually a viewer submission, which is really fun. We love getting those. So if you have an idea for a show topic, like send it to us because we often do them. And this person wrote in and said, you know, there's a lot of ways to talk about periods with your children and they vary so much parent to parent. So they were curious about, you know, the way that we navigate it, especially because we're girl moms and we each have two girls. And so, you know, it's fun because the average age, according to the internet, of when children start their period is usually between 10 and about 16. And the average in the middle of that is about 12. Yeah. And so you've got girls that are teens. I have an almost, 10-year-old on my side and a toddler.
You've got a tween.
I've got an almost tween. Let's not go there just yet. I'm not ready. So we've got different perspectives because I'm looking at it as this conversation I will eventually be having and kind of looking at the lead up of that. Whereas you've had this conversation and you are in the thick of it. Claire, I've got to ask before we get into this. Yeah. I've heard that when you live with other women or you're in close proximity, that you often sync, like your cycles will sync. Is that what's happening to Kyle over there? Like, is there a whole household of women that are on their periods at the same time?
So it's funny you said that. And I heard this years ago. I think my sister-in-law mentioned it to me once, like years ago, 20 years ago. And I think it is a thing because I do notice that when I'm on my period, the girls tend to be on their period at the same time. So I do think that's a thing. I didn't do any research into that. I didn't know whether there's like medical evidence.
I think there is. Because I've noticed it too. Like even I've noticed it with one of my best friends. We synced up and then we've gone on to move away from each other and we're still synced up. And so whenever she gets kind of feisty, I'm like, well, lady, we're about 10 days out. So like, let's take a look at our feelings.
Well, listen, I mean, I didn't think to research that element for today's show, but if any of our listeners know a bit about that, share it with us, because I don't know whether it's just an old wives' tale or whether there is, legit evidence scientific wise to back it up, but I do think that's the thing. It does happen in our house.
Yeah. So before we get started, let's talk a little bit about us and like our experience, because I think that as parents, we receive parenting like from our parents and it informs how good or bad, whatever way it swings, how we might approach things with our kids. And so Claire, tell me a little bit about like your experience with your first period, what kind of
Yeah.
conversations you had leading up to it, and what that looked like for you.
Yeah, so okay, so I was really quite late starting my period. Now, I know you just mentioned, Christina, that generally girls start their periods between the ages of 10 and 16. The average is around 12. Well, I was later. I was like 15. And the reason I
Mhm.
think that that was the case, I don't know again whether this is a scientific conclusion, but I was training to go to ballet school when I was in my teens. And so I was, training every single day for several hours a day. And I always wondered whether that kind of delayed things for me, because I'd heard certainly that happening with gymnasts.
Yeah,
And so, yeah,
I've
so
heard
I was
that.
15, yeah, and all my friends had already started. So I had a good idea of what to expect because I was the last one really out of my friends. Um, and I do remember thinking, though, that I was under pressure almost to start my period because, at that age, you're wanting to be the same as your peers and the same as, your friends. You don't want to be the odd one out.
Yeah.
I even remember a couple of adults, like, kind of looking a little bit concerned when they'd asked me if I'd started my period, like other women that not necessarily family members, just older women that I was, friends with at the time that were in my life. Um, and they would ask, "Oh, have you got your period?" And I'd say no, and they'd look really concerned, and that used to worry me a little bit. So I was quite relieved actually when I started my period because I felt like I was normal or the same as my friends. So yeah, so I was, like I say, I was kind of a late bloomer, if you like, with regards to my period. Um, and I just remember, I don't think my mum made a big deal out of it. I think it had been mentioned, I knew about obviously periods. My friends had already got them. We'd spoken about it at school. And I remember my mum saying, when it came to acne or whatever, she'd say things like, "Oh, that'll settle down when you get your period," which actually, with hindsight, I don't think it does.
You're like,
I
lies
think
you
the exact
tell.
opposite. I know. What the heck
Oh
was that
God.
about, Mum? But so it was mentioned, but I don't remember my mum ever having, a specific talk about, okay, so when you get your period, this is what you do. I think it was a case of, I got my period, I told her, and she was like, okay, so this is what you can use. So it wasn't very dramatic, and I think because I was, like I say, the last one in my friend group to get my period, I felt like I knew a lot about it, and so it didn't catch me off guard like I think it would have done had I got my period a lot younger. But how about you? When did you get your period?
Yeah, well, here's the deal with well, first off, I want to just say that that's great that you had an open dialogue with your friend group because
Yeah.
I think that that's important too, like to get
Mhm.
information from people that are in the thick of it with you.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
sometimes parents can make it awkward or like,
Yeah.
especially back before because it wasn't something that was just so out in the open like it is now.
Yes.
In the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, it was
Yeah.
like this shameful secret only women held. And like
Yeah.
now you'll find references to periods in like modern day culture. But
Mm.
going back to your question, so for me in my period, I it's hard to detail exactly when I started
Uh-huh.
because I think I started early and then
Right.
I might have had a light period and went a long time without another and then
Yes.
actually started getting regular periods around 14.
Okay.
And so I do believe that I did start my period sooner. I can't recall exactly the date, but definitely before that. But
Mm.
when I brought it to the attention of my mom, she didn't like she was excited about it. She was like, "Oh, that's great for you. Like, here's pads and blah blah blah." She like put them on my bed. But then when I didn't get it the next month, it was like, "Oh, well, maybe you never got your period at all. You're just kind of lying." It was kind of like this there was a disconnect of education of like you can get your period and then go period like a few months without another and then
Yeah.
get a period again and that's totally normal for your first periods.
Oh, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I won't go into specific details with about my girls because they've been mortified, but I know
Yeah,
that
don't
that's
do that.
very, no, no, we'll not do that. Oh my God, they'd kill me. But just speaking in general terms, it's very normal. From what I, can see and what I've heard, that when you start your period, it's a long time before you're regular. I mean, a good year in lots of instances, or maybe even longer than that. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, so that seems like that was pretty normal. But and so how did you? I mean, were you embarrassed, or did you just take it in your
You know,
stride?
when it actually happened, I, like you, I had peers that had already started a little bit
Mm.
before me. I was not like looking forward to it because at the time, the way it was talked about was this like huge burden. It was
Yes.
like this thing that you had to do every month and how annoying. And all I saw was negative talk about it. And so I was like, I'm in no rush to receive this like gift, right?
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, it was a weird stage in girlhood where I wanted to be grown up. Like I wanted to be like a woman. And I remember feeling very like little baby about it, like when I was 13 and I didn't have my period. And so
Mm.
yeah, I think the culture of it being kind of shameful tainted my view of it as it was coming into fruition. And then as far as like when it actually happened, it was more like logistics, like, okay, we got to make sure that we have this pad. And back in the day, there wasn't very many options for period products. And so it was like either this small, tiny little panty liner or this jumbo pad
Yeah. I
that
remember
you have to
those.
walk all like lopsided.
Yeah. Oh my God, I remember. You just
Oh,
reminded me
God.
of something. So I remember in elementary school, or primary school, as we call it in England, excuse me, a teacher gave the girls a talk. So all the girls were taken to one side. The boys were, I don't know, off playing football or whatever they were doing. And she she started off by saying she was basically recalling her experience of when she got her period, but it was so dramatic. And she said, I thought I was going to die when I first found out that I was bleeding, and it was so dramatic. And and then it was like you said, it was very much like, you're not going to be able to go swimming at this time of the, and it's going to be extremely painful. And it was all like, my God, like why would anybody want this? Um, so that was
Yeah. I
definitely, I
love that
think,
you brought in
culture.
education because yes, it is certain parts of
Yeah,
the United States right now are trying to block that from happening. But like in the time I was growing up, we also had like a health class. And
yeah,
I remember it being like a lot of like scientific stuff and
yes,
not a lot of like what will
practical.
I experience, like
Yeah,
what is this going to look like for me. So
yeah.
I saw like what looked to be like a giant butterfly, which was like a picture of like ovaries and stuff, and I'm like, wait, how does this connect to me? Because girl, like real talk, the birds and the bees conversation, we'll talk about that in a later episode.
Mhm.
It was not a conversation I had had. And so it was very like scattered, all the information I knew. And so I
Oh,
didn't even know that like how many like holes you had down there. Like I didn't know like anything about anything. And so I just remember when we got that education in this like the sixth grade, I think, I was
yeah, yeah.
like, what part of my body is that? Like is that
Yeah.
my stomach? Like what's happening?
Oh wow. Yeah, but I think that you're right. I think, back in the day, back in the 90s or the, early 2000s, I think it was much more medical and very
Yeah.
it was just a formality, and it was kind of, it went over the top of your head. Well, it did mine. It's like, well, okay, I'm really not following particularly
Yeah.
with what you're saying here. And so I think because of that, I did rely on my friends who had already experienced their periods for
Yeah.
guidance and information, much more so than the adults around me, actually, including teachers. Um, but I mean,
Yeah. So
fast
we had
forward,
these experiences, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
then we went and had girls.
exactly. So let's
So
fast
how did
forward
you like
to
take your
now.
experience and then shift it into the way that you wanted to parent? How did this conversation go about with your children?
Okay, so I don't think I've actually had a conversation about my experience of when I got my period. I'm just trying to think. I don't know whether I've actually discussed with them how it was for me. I don't think they've asked, and I don't think I've volunteered it. I'm trying to rack my
Hmm.
brain now for that conversation. It's not because I've not, we haven't discussed periods. I just don't know whether I've said, okay, so this is what happened to me. I think I've mentioned what time, what age I got my period. But I don't think I've ever recalled the story that I've just shared now about the teacher saying, oh, I thought I was going to die, or whatever. But I've
Well, when
always,
did your girls first become aware of like periods in general?
okay. So what I did was, now this might be a bit of a cop out, but I also highly recommend it because it broaches the subject in an age appropriate way by people that are far cleverer than I am at wording this kind of topic. So I bought a book. I bought a book for the girls, and it was age appropriate, and it was just about like their changing bodies. So it wasn't just about periods, but that was included. It was just about puberty in general, and what that looks like, and the emotional side of things. And it's a really great book, and it was totally relatable and understandable. And so I got this book for my eldest. And then 2 years later, I passed it down to my younger one. I think I got that book at around probably 10, maybe 9, because it's aimed at tweens. It's not aimed at 17-year-olds, and it's not aimed at 5-year-olds. It's very, I would say it's, it was aimed at kind of 9 to 13-year-olds, that age range. So I got that book. I think when my eldest was around, I want to say around 10, before she'd started middle school for sure. I think maybe the last year of primary school, or elementary school. And so, she read it, and I would say to her, do you want to talk about it? If there's any questions, just ask me. And so I left it open. I left the dialogue open. And so that's how I initially broached the whole, period thing. And then they have been very open with me. And so I think I've done something right, because they'll tell me when they get their period. They'll tell me if they're feeling uncomfortable, if they've got cramps or tummy aches. They'll let me know if they need more pads. I've kind of demonstrated how to use stuff, and they've been pretty, like I say, open. So that's how I've approached it. I think you're going to be a lot more explicit than I was. I just had this, Christina, which is a good
Me? Me
I like
explicit? That's crazy.
yeah. Why would I ever think that? So come on, to tell me how you're going to approach this subject, or have you already spoken about this with your eldest?
Yeah, I mean, here's the deal is for me and my parenting, the biggest thing that I remember from my childhood is the shame and the
Right.
secrecy and the cloak and dagger of it all. And I really wanted to eliminate shame in my parenting.
Yeah.
When it comes to body image, I'm really powerful with that. Your body and the things that it does. Sexual things, like as that occurs, I will be a little bit more open, I think, than most parents. And I just feel like creating a dialogue is really great. I love that your girls have that with you.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like it's not one conversation that I want to have. It's kind of like a series of conversations as they grow up that I'm going to be having.
Yes.
And I feel like I'll handle like sexual questions and stuff, which again, another episode, but like I'll handle it very similar where it's like, as you ask questions, age appropriately, I will answer those questions
Mm-hmm.
and, share with you things and not make it like this secrecy type thing, make it more open. And so, my daughter Stella started noticing that I was having periods because when she was potty training, I would bring her into the bathroom with me and she would sit on her toddler potty and I would sit on my potty and like we would go potty together. And she didn't really go. She kind of just sat with me. It was more of like the routine of it all.
Yeah.
And a couple times, in the beginning, I would have my period and I was pretty open about what it was because she asked. She
Yeah.
didn't ask with words because at the time she was nonverbal. She was looking at it and looking at me and looking at it again, like, what the hell is happening? And
Oh,
I explained to her, I said, oh, mommy's on her period. And I said it very age appropriately, women every single month bleed a little bit. It doesn't hurt. And mommy uses a special Band-Aid that she puts in her panties to kind of capture the blood so it doesn't get on my clothes. And I kind of just like left it at that. There was no follow-up questions because again, nonverbal child.
yeah.
But she knew about periods because I was very open about the bathroom situation. Cut to my current toddler. She's more verbal and she's recently seen me and she says, boo boo, ouch.
Oh.
And she's
Oh.
aware of like, that's a
Wow.
cut, right?
Yeah.
And I've done the same exact thing. It's like, I tell her exactly what's happening. And again, no further questions because she's tiny, but like it opens up the dialogue of like, this is just something that happens to us. It's not shameful or ugly or anything you have to hide. But I will say that I got into it further with Stella because, and I can share on here, because she doesn't go on social and she won't see this, that,
You're so lucky.
we recently may or may not have encountered her first period. I'm not quite sure just
Mm,
yet, but
mm,
we did talk about periods just in case it is one.
mm.
A little bit of light bleeding, could be other things, could be that, not sure yet. But we talked about periods, and it was so funny because she had recently watched this movie.
Which
it's
one?
called it's called Turning Red. It's a Disney
Oh
Pixar
yeah.
movie.
Yes, I know. Yeah, the girls have seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cute. It's on Disney
Yeah.
Plus if you are a
Yeah.
parent. It's got a little bit of like talking back. Like I don't love the way that she treats her mom, but like whatevs. Um but if you have a tween, I think that'd be a really great movie. But in the movie, it's basically about this little girl who wakes up one day and she is a panda. Like she turns into a red panda and she tries to hide it and be all shifty. And her mom is like, "What's happening with this little kid?" And thinks she started her period. Come to find out, she's actually turning into a panda. And her mom goes, "Oh, yeah, this is something that happens in our family." And it's like this thing that she's been trying to hide from her mom, but then her mom's like, "This is normal." Um, and it got me thinking about, Stella. And so as Stella was watching the movie, we were talking a little bit about the period part of it. And I said, yeah, just like in Turning Red, she doesn't know that she's going to become a panda. When you get your period, you won't know what's happening until it happens. It's like that's why her mom thought it was her period. And I don't know how much got in here, right? Like sometimes I talk to her and I don't know. But that night when we thought she had got on her period because of the bleeding, she said, I don't want to be a panda.
Oh my God, that's so
Because she
sweet.
connected the dots of like, wait a second.
That's really great that she obviously understands the concept because, you've
Yeah.
had this openness. And actually, thinking back to the girls, I have always been very open with, my body. I've been to the bathroom when they've been in the bathroom with me.
Yeah.
From them being little, I've been naked around them, and it's not, and I've just because I haven't wanted things like body image to become obsessions of theirs. I've not wanted them to obsess over their weight or over their body in any way. And so
Yeah.
I've tried to do that as well, just take the shame out of it, and just be kind of very laid back with that type of thing. So I've
Yeah.
created in the process
Absolutely.
an open dialogue with them. I mean, don't get me wrong, I mean that if they walk into the bedroom and I'm getting changed and I'm semi naked or naked or whatever, they're like horrified now because they're
Like,
at that age
ah.
where everything's embarrassing. But I didn't make a big deal of it when they were growing up because, like I say, I didn't want body image to become a negative thing or an obsession. And so
Yeah.
I think that's probably the key here. I think even though you've done more explaining than me, which, by the way, I really admire. I
Well,
do
and
admire
I'll
that
go
about you.
further.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
with
go
you.
on. Yeah,
I want them to have their own autonomy, and I want them to know about their body and what it does, like thoroughly all of the things. And so
yeah,
even with Stella, like when I was explaining to her what had happened, I wanted to make sure she was on her period. And the only way
yeah,
to really know that is to like check out what's going on down there. And
yeah,
rather than me doing it, I got a hand mirror and we
yeah,
sat down on the ground and I had
yeah.
her take a look. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, this is your vagina and this is your labia. And I shared with her what things are. And I was like, let's take a look and see if there's any blood inside. And like, we talked about this is your body. You get to look at your own body. And then I also explained to her that really nobody should be looking at this part except for mommy and a doctor.
Okay, that's
Um,
great. Yeah.
because I don't want her. But I will say I might have been a little too open with her because the next day my mother-in-law came over to pick her up for school and she yelled, Abby, I'm bleeding.
Oh my god,
And
what did
I
your
and I had to
mother-in-law say?
explain to her, and I told her, I pulled her aside and I said, you know what? It's nothing to be ashamed of. I'm glad you're happy about it. But just like other things our bodies do, like going to the bathroom, it's kind of something you don't need to announce to everyone. Like you
Oh
can
my
just
god, that's so
keep that in
sweet.
here.
Okay. What did your
Like
mother-in-law do?
she
How did
thought
she
it
do
was,
it?
she didn't really know what to do. She was kind of like, don't move, don't react.
Oh my
Because you
god.
don't know what to say to that. It's like, good
Yeah.
job, kid. Like, I don't know what to do.
Oh, well, I
But
think
I
you're
think
doing it
it's so
right for
important to
celebrating.
know what's going on with your body, and what better way than kind of looking at it with her and being like, this is what your body is. Like, you don't need to be ashamed of anything. And if there's anything going on, I even said, because she's going to her dad's house, every other weekend, I said, if
Mm.
anything's ever happening with your vagina, like anything itches or there's anything coming out of it or any of that
Yeah.
stuff, call mommy, because daddy doesn't have a vagina and he doesn't really know much about it.
Yeah. So no, absolutely. And so that's something again I've been very open about with the girls. And they, if there's any issues down there, like you say, with like thrush or whatever, they do always let me know, because it's really important. And there's nothing worse as a woman, because and we'll talk about this on a different episode, but I have suffered from severe UTI infections to the point where
Oh,
I need to go to hospital. I've got them under control now because I have this regime down that I use. But they're extremely painful, and I don't want them having to suffer through something like that and be too embarrassed to tell me what's going on, because they can actually be really dangerous. And so I think it's essential that you have that open dialogue with your kid,
yeah.
especially if you have a daughter, because you want them to be able to share stuff with you without feeling embarrassed or ashamed. But let's just touch upon, I hadn't even thought about this angle, but you have a friend who has sons, and she's
Yeah.
also very open about her period with her sons. Like, tell me a bit about that, because that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
I have a good friend who we parent very similar. Like, we're very,
Mm,
very similar in the way that we guide our kids. And she's got a child who is almost 11, and then
mm,
another child who's about to enter kindergarten. And so
okay.
two boys.
Yeah.
And they also recently watched the Turning Red movie and had some questions. And it's not that, this friend has been bringing her kids into the bathroom being like, this is mommy's period. I don't know that that's happening. But what is happening is dialogue about
Mm,
what periods are. And so that movie was a great, stomping point, or it's not stomping point, but kind of a carryover into a more
yeah.
organic conversation about periods.
Yeah.
And what was great about what she did is she talked about the symptoms that somebody on the outside of a period might see of a woman. So,
Mm,
things like women experience cramps, women experience hormonal fluctuations. For instance, and I only learned this recently, women go through a hormonal cycle that's about 30 days long, with ups and downs and sideways and all the things,
yeah.
versus men who have a 24-hour cycle. And
Wow.
so she shared kind of like what it looks like to be on the outside of that and what you might have going on with the woman in your life, and ways you can support her. And so
That's
she's
so
just
great.
building amazing men over there.
And so exactly. And if you think about it historically, this has not been, and I'm not saying it's necessarily been men's fault actually, because I don't think they've been educated, but periods have always been a source of jokes. And if a woman's not feeling great, oh, she must be, is it PMT, is it that but in a sarcastic kind of disrespectful way. And so women who are on the period have always been the butt of jokes, generally from men.
Yeah.
And there's been definitely a lack of empathy and understanding. But then I think that men generally don't know what's going on, and they've never been taught. And so I think it's difficult to expect empathy from them if they have never either been taught or, bothered to, as adults, look for themselves and research for themselves what goes on every month, because it's a whole, I mean, let me put it like this: if my husband got periods, oh my god, it would just be like the most dramatic, my God, this is what I have to do
Oh
every
my God.
month. Everyone would know about it. I mean, I'm just telling you right
Oh, they
now.
could never. They could never, Claire.
Absolutely not. They couldn't at all. They'd be
Mm-mm.
like, oh, no, oh God, you don't expect me to do that. I'm bleeding, and
Well, and
you know,
also there
oh,
would be like free tampons and pads and all sorts of shit
oh,
everywhere if men were
everywhere,
period.
everywhere. Which leads me on to something I wanted to talk about. Now, have you heard of something called period poverty?
Just a little bit because I've seen
Okay.
it with homelessness, like people who don't
Yes,
have access to period
yes,
products. But share a
yeah.
little bit with our audience about period poverty.
Okay, so period poverty is basically where a woman cannot afford or has access to period wear. So we're talking about pads, tampons, anything related to periods, basically. And I just want to quote quite a shocking statistic. This is from the Journal of Global Health. So this is a report that they did. So, two-thirds of the 16.9 million low income women in the US could not afford menstrual products in the past year, with a half of this needing to choose between menstrual products and food. So, let's just like rack our brains around that. 17 million women, girls, teenagers, and grown women in the US basically can't afford period wear. They can't afford to buy pads, and if they do, that may come at the expense of them eating or feeding their families. And
Wow.
so that really upsets me, because if you think about how stressful and how frightening, periods can be to young girls who don't have the open relationships with their mums that our kids have with us, they may be in the foster care system. They don't have that structure and safety around them. And on top of that, they're from extremely, low income households. How terrible that, they're not able to go to school, and they're not able to, leave the house because they're too ashamed, because they literally are bleeding, and they can't afford, or their parents can't afford to buy products to help them. And that really, really bothers me. So, our girls are lucky that we're always going to be able to supply them with what they need. But
Yeah.
there are a lot of there, and particularly because I have teen girls now, there are a lot of teen girls out there who are not as fortunate as our kids. And just think about the emotional and mental toll that must take on you as a young child, and how that would form, your emotions and psyche around that moving forward. So it's a shocking statistic, and I would like us at some point, Christina, to really get behind that and shed light on that, because I think that's a very worthy cause. And I think when you're a mum to girls that could potentially be vulnerable had they have grown up in a different circumstance, it really hits home.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned something about like how many people, but then also
Mhm.
connected to that poverty line are usually parents who are working as hard as they freaking can, or
Yeah.
are possibly absent. And so, who is talking to these girls also about these other things? So, it's like the access to the materials, which may
Mm,
vary person to person. There's a lot of things available now these days, but then
mm,
also like the talk. Are they experiencing any sort of support when it comes to that? Are the parents unable to provide a pad, but maybe giving some sort of alternative? I've heard of a lot of sustainable like alternatives and things like that.
mm.
But the talk, like, are they also, because the connection between low income and absentee family, whether it's from working or from just being absent in general, is kind of strong. So that is
Yeah.
such a worthy cause. And it makes me think about how many things are available now and how many things could benefit those girls.
Mm,
When my daughter got her whole possible period, um I thought, well, what's going to be the easiest for her, like
yeah.
navigating this? Because my daughter's on this autism spectrum, and it could be kind of like confusing on how to navigate a pad and a tampon and all that stuff. And there are period underwears available these days that you can wash and rewash, and they're something you can ongoingly have and not have to purchase every single month.
Yeah.
And that could be a solution for those types of women, is that having something you could reuse. You
Mm,
could buy the one time, whether it be the period underwear, or they have, the Diva cups, or reusable pads that are made of cotton. Like, things that they can keep and have maybe donated to them and then, utilize them every month.
Yeah, because things have evolved, thank goodness,
I know.
since
From the
you and I
giant
first
pads we
started.
had
My
to
God, yeah.
navigate.
So, I mean, you'll see even on social media, these products that you're talking about, the companies behind them, their adverts, their commercials, their reels or posts are very open. They're taking the shame out of it. They're normalizing, which is something that's very normal.
Do you,
Um,
on that point though, Claire, do you remember the commercials we got where it was like blue water on a pad and then like
yeah,
a woman that's like dancing in like dandelions and like
and I also remember if ever they came on the TV, you were watching them with your family. It was like, oh my God, like I know my dad would feel really uncomfortable. It was like, oh, quickly, like let's get past this commercial. Hurry up with this. We'd be like, oh, so, would anyone like a cup of tea? Or
let me get out of
anything,
this situation.
distract.
And
Yeah,
again, like I think because we've shifted as a culture, the conversations you mentioned earlier about the boys knowing more, the men knowing more, is more and more available to them too. But
yeah,
there's a lot of education that needs to happen, whether that's the school's decision or the parents or what have you. Even my adult husband, when I started living with him and having periods in his home and like discussing them amongst ourselves, he didn't know a lot of facts about periods, like,
yeah,
and he had grown up with a sister and a mother, and just didn't know. Like he thought
yeah,
that you, when you're on your period, are your most like upset. And I was like,
right.
no honey, like you are experiencing PMS before your period, to the
Yeah.
point where if a woman pees in the toilet and sees that she's got her period, she's like, thank God I can stop being a bitch. Like
Yeah,
like
and
that's
I
me.
think
I'm like, thank God it's here. Like, oh, I hope I chill out.
that's funny. But I think the same would go for my husband. I don't think, again, he would know much about how they work and
No.
how that looks with regards to emotions and all of that.
And if
And
they knew, they
yeah,
could have so much power, because there are certain times of the month where we are more agreeable, we are more
yeah,
open to new ideas. Like scientifically, there are things to know about your wife that you should know. But
well, maybe we
I
should tell them if they're going to take advantage, actually. Maybe I take all of this back.
I
you know?
know, right?
Yeah, I don't know whether this is such a good idea. I tell you, I've got a question.
Okay.
So you mentioned about Stella potentially getting her first period. So how does that look for a girl who is on the spectrum? How is that different from a teenager or a young girl who isn't on the spectrum?
I love that you asked that question because it's so different kid by
Yeah,
kid. So
yeah,
I have friends who have children who've started their period and they're like 11. And
hmm,
for that child, having to navigate it would be really hard because they're nonverbal.
yeah,
They don't understand a lot of concepts. And so it makes more sense to do something like this parent has chosen to put her child on a depot shot, which is a form of birth control that does stop periods.
hmm,
And maybe that won't be her forever decision. Like maybe as the child becomes more and more aware of her own body, that decision will change. But for now, that's what makes the most sense for them, versus other parents who maybe have teens that are wearing, diapers, adult depends, during their period because they are far more, they're needing a lot more help. And
hmm,
so it depends, I think, on your child's development. Are
hmm,
they able to make sure that their body stays clean? Are they able to make sure that they can change their, period product of choice? Can they communicate with you about their period in general? So it differs. And I think
hmm,
the introduction of things like period panties and, diva cups and things like that have made it a lot easier for those kinds of parents, because it's kind of something that can navigate it while giving them some agencies in their own body.
hmm.
Because to be able to wear, like, for instance, a period panty rather than like an adult depends, to me seems a little bit more like if I were that child, I would feel a little bit more like advocacy for my body if I was able to do that versus like the depends. But
Yeah,
it
it's
depends.
really
It totally
interesting.
depends on the
Depends on the
situation.
child. Yeah, yeah, for sure. One other thing I just want to touch upon is I'm really strongly for only giving my girls organic or
Mm.
products that basically products that don't contain potentially harmful chemicals, because I read a couple of years ago, well, several years ago now, that there were some. Now I can't find the article right now to quote you, so this is, I can't refer to some stats as I'm talking right now, but basically there was some concern that the chemicals used in some sanitary ware, so tampons and pads, could contribute to cancer, particularly cervical cancer. And so, after reading that, I'm very, very particular that the pads I buy for my girls are organic and they are free of any kind of nasty dyes or potentially harmful chemicals. So that's something else. They are slightly more expensive than the other stuff. That
Yeah.
is the only thing. I wish they weren't, because I could see that being a barrier for some mums. And they're not always available depending which shop you're going to. I mean, I generally get them from CVS and they have a few options, but then I've been to other stores that don't have any, or they may have one, and they're considerably more expensive than the regular brand that does contain chemicals. So, I mean, that's my personal choice, but I'm very cautious that I only buy stuff that doesn't contain potential
Well,
nasty.
that makes a lot of sense. And I think that there are a lot of things to consider when it comes to the product you're using, both in like how you're using it and also what it does to your body. And even,
Yeah,
tampons in general, whether it's an
yeah,
eco-friendly, more sustainable type situation, they can cause toxic shock syndrome. And there's a lot of things
yeah,
around that. And so I just think
absolutely.
it's really important that you have an open dialogue with your child and you do whatever you think is best as a parent to make sure your children have what they need. And periods are just there's so many things about them that create a lot more dialogue about other things, and they are the
Yeah,
start of this like little girl turning into a woman. And it's just a weird time. We talked about this a little bit before we got on air, but that time between like 9.5 9 years old to about 14, you're just so awkward and
it's such
like
an awkward, it's such an awkward stage. That's the absolutely perfect word to
it's
use,
just
awkward. You don't
terrible.
know,
I
you
remember
don't know
I
what to do
had
yourself, and
orange crimped hair and like I was wearing like the weirdest clothes. I was trying to fit into this group or that group. And it was like,
yeah,
I just didn't know who I was, what my body was doing, what anybody was doing. So just I think as parents, all we can do is just create these open dialogues and make sure our kids have what they need to be the best them in all aspects, not just periods, with all the things. And I love that we're talking about this because we're part of this conversation, removing the stigma, and hopefully someone catches this episode and can pass it along to whoever might need it. I know my friend mentioned, I have a single dad who could really use a little 411. And I was like, listen to our upcoming podcast.
oh, that's great. Well, I really hope that dad is listening to this, because I hadn't considered that situation, and that must be particularly hard for a guy
Oh,
to have that talk with their daughter if there isn't a mum figure around.
it was so funny. I will share one antidote before we go.
Okay.
So I was rocking the toddler to bed the other day, and it was during this time where I thought maybe we should have some period products with Stella and, having a pad on and whatever. And it was time for her to change her pad.
Uh-huh.
And he goes, mom, she needs to change her pad. I'm like, I can't leave this rocking station. This kid only wants me right now. He's like, we are at a crossroads. And I'm like, you're going to need to hand her the pad and then just walk out of the room and like maybe leave the door cracked and like just talk to her through it. They're going to have to coach her through it. And he did. He like coached her through opening it and like peeling the sticker off and putting it on her underwear. And he did a great job. He's like, I'm not going to double check, but like it's on, like you go check. And he goes, scratch this off the list of things I thought I'd never do. Never did I ever think that this was something that I would be doing in my home.
Oh my God. Well, good on Alex. That was a great job.
Oh man, but you got to think about it. There's a lot of people who maybe are being raised by grandparents or single
Yeah.
dads or different situations. And like things like this, resources like that are on the internet, books like you gave your girls, those are the guiding lights for them. And it's important that we have these combos.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of the Momversation Club.
And if you've enjoyed today's show, which we hope you have, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a review. Your support helps us reach even more moms and build a stronger village.
Until next time, bye.